The order was typed. It was signed. It was sealed. And then, it was quietly ignored. It was a cold, gray morning in April of 1945. Across Europe, the war was closing in on its final moments. Allied armies were pushing hard from the west, while the Red Army thundered forward from the east. Germany was collapsing, piece by piece. And in the middle of it all, a single decision was placed on the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. That decision would go on to divide historians for generations. Berlin was exposed. The German capital, the very symbol of Nazi power, the nerve center of the Third Reich, was suddenly within reach. For months, everyone had assumed the same ending. A final race. A dramatic showdown. The moment Allied forces would storm Berlin and bring the war to a decisive close. That's what everyone expected. Instead, Eisenhower stopped. This decision did not come from fear. It did not come from hesitation. And it certainly did not come from weakness. It came from calculation, cold, careful, and strategic. A decision that made sense on paper, but whose consequences would stretch far beyond the battlefield. To understand why this moment still haunts historians, you first have to understand the pressure closing in on the Allied command. For months, American and British troops had fought relentlessly through the Ardennes. They had crossed the Rhine under fire. They had shattered what remained of Germany's defenses. Every mile forward had been paid for in blood. But morale was high. Momentum was unstoppable. Among the soldiers, there was no doubt. Berlin was the prize. Officers planned for it. Maps were spread across tables. Routes were marked. Casualty estimates were grim, but they were accepted. Then the order came. The Western Allies would not advance on Berlin. The reaction was immediate and explosive. British commanders protested openly. American generals questioned the logic behind the decision. Winston Churchill was furious, though he kept his anger private. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery believed it was a catastrophic political mistake, one that would echo long after the war was over. But Eisenhower did not change his mind. Berlin, he believed, simply was not worth the cost. On paper, his reasoning was clear. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviet forces were already closer. Urban warfare inside Berlin would be brutal, street by street, building by building, and it would cost tens of thousands of Allied lives. Germany was already collapsing. The war, Eisenhower believed, would end no matter who captured the city. What no one could fully see, what no one could yet measure, was how that single decision would redraw the world. Because Berlin was more than just a city. It was a symbol. A psychological finish line. The final proof of victory in a war defined by ideology. American troops were less than 100 miles away. Soviet forces were closer, but only slightly. In the end, speed mattered more than distance. And speed was something the Western Allies had in abundance. General Omar Bradley believed Berlin could be taken. General George Patton was furious. "We're letting them have it," Patton said bitterly, speaking of the Soviets. All of it. Eisenhower saw things differently. As Supreme Allied Commander, he believed the goal of the war was to defeat Germany, not to race an ally for political advantage. At the Yalta Conference, the zones of occupation had already been agreed upon. Berlin lay deep inside the Soviet zone. Capturing it, Eisenhower believed, would not change the post-war map. It would only increase the number of dead. But war is never only about maps. Churchill understood that. He believed whoever took Berlin would shape the future of Europe. Control of the city meant leverage. It meant authority. It meant power. Still, Eisenhower chose restraint. The Western advance turned south, toward Bavaria and Austria. Berlin was left to the Red Army. On the front lines, soldiers heard rumors but received no clear explanation. Some felt relief, knowing they would not be sent into the ruins of a dying city. Others felt something else entirely, robbed of purpose, robbed of closure, robbed of the final victory they believed they had earned. Meanwhile, Soviet forces prepared for what would become the bloodiest urban battle of the entire war. When the Red Army entered Berlin in late April 1945, it did so with fury born from years of devastation. What followed was nothing short of apocalyptic. Artillery flattened entire neighborhoods. Civilians hid in basements, listening as the city collapsed around them. Fires burned day and night. Soviet troops advanced street by street, room by room, through endless ruins. German resistance was desperate, fanatical, and in the end, completely futile. The casualties were staggering. Tens of thousands were killed in just a few days. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life beneath the ruins of the empire he had built. Berlin fell soon after. On May 8th, the war in Europe officially ended. From a purely military standpoint, Eisenhower's logic seemed sound. Germany was defeated. Allied lives had been spared. The war was over. But peace has a way of revealing consequences that war hides. In the months that followed, Berlin became a divided city, not divided by rubble, but by ideology. Soviet control hardened. Political arrests began. Democratic institutions were reshaped or erased entirely. Across Eastern Europe, the same pattern appeared again and again. Countries that had been liberated by the Red Army were absorbed into a new sphere of influence. Soon, Winston Churchill would warn the world of an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. And Eisenhower began to wonder. Behind closed doors, Allied leaders quietly questioned whether Berlin should have been taken after all, not for glory, but for balance. By the way, if you're still here with me, holding on to this moment, make sure to hit subscribe, because what came next shaped the next 50 years of world history. The Cold War did not begin with a single announcement. It emerged slowly, quietly, from decisions like this one. Berlin became the front line of a new conflict. The Berlin Airlift. The Wall. Spies. Standoffs. Nuclear brinkmanship. Historians began asking the question no general ever wants to hear. What if? What if American tanks had reached Berlin first? What if the city had been liberated together? What if Eastern Europe had followed a different path? There are no simple answers. Only competing truths. Some believe Eisenhower saved countless lives and preserved Allied unity. Others believe he sacrificed Europe's future for short-term logic. What cannot be denied is this: that decision shaped the world that followed. Eisenhower never apologized. He defended his choice until the end of his life. The war, he insisted, was about defeating Nazism, not positioning for post-war dominance. The cost of Berlin, he believed, would have been unforgivable. And maybe, he was right. But history is not judged by intent. It is judged by consequence. Today, Berlin stands united once more. The wall is gone. The city lives again. But the question still lingers. Was restraint wisdom? Or was it a mistake? Historians continue to argue. Documents are still studied. Memoirs are still dissected. Because some decisions end wars. Others begin the next one. And this was the World War II decision that still haunts historians.